Turning it over now to Ellen to introduce our next speaker.
All right, thanks. Okay, so I'm really excited for our first presentation of the day. I have the privilege of introducing Brian Klass. He is the Senior Technology Officer at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health's Center for Teaching and Learning. He also has a faculty appointment in the school's R3 Center for Innovation and Science Education. As the architect for online learning technology at the school, he leads a team that designs and delivers custom online courseware to thousands of students around the world each year. In addition to designing software and delivering courses, he leads faculty training and development courses and teaches graduate level courses on communications design and data visualization for non-expert audiences. Brian heads the IT Accessibility Training and Education Subcommittee and the Hopkins University Design for Learning initiative at Johns Hopkins. Brian has presented on techniques for successful online learning delivery and UDL programs at conferences throughout the country, including EDUCAUSE, OLC, TeachX, UB Tech, APHA, Tech Ed, Syllabus, and CUE. So thank you so much for being here, Brian. I'm looking forward to seeing another one of your compelling presentations.
Thanks, Ellen. Greatly appreciate that introduction. I forgot it was so long when I wrote it. I got to cut that thing down. Very important. Hi, everybody. Really glad to be here. Sat in for the last 10 minutes listening in on some of the amazing public health work that you are all doing in Michigan. It's really kind of awesome. Hopefully you can all see my slides okay. Thumbs up. You can see it okay. Great. Excellent. Then I'm going to go ahead and get started. Because this is I'm a little bit fast paced. So I won't go too far over time, I hope, or not over time at all. But I love giving this talk. Ellen, I got to give a shout out back to Ellen, who saw me give this version of this talk at CADCA down in Orlando last summer. And I love talking about presentations and speaking and communicating to non-expert audiences, because in public health and the health sciences, we spend a lot of time talking to experts. And it's so important to be able to speak to non-expert audiences, especially when we're out building coalitions, working with community partners, speaking to parents. It's a different set of skills in some ways. Same knowledge, different set of skills. And I love talking about that because I'm not an expert in so many things public health. And I learn a lot better when people can speak to me in a way that I kind of understand. So that's the background. I'm going to go ahead and get started because I'm rambling now, not on topic. So we live in an attention economy. There's multiple modes of input, competing sources of information, different stimulus biochemical responses are competing for our attention at any given time, right? Right now, I'm competing with email or pop-ups or chat or Word documents you might have open on your computer, or the coffee kicking in, or whatever it is, information pouring in on our devices, our phones, our laptops all the time. And we're being conditioned, whether we recognize it or not, to spend less time holding focus on a single task and more time going from one quick casual reward to another. Yeah, I'll get to that in a second. And this is why games like Fortnite and Wordle are really popular, right? You pick them up, you play for a couple minutes, put them down, walk away feeling splendid if you happen to have solved the Wordle puzzle splendid. That's usually where I end up, is like that fourth row, splendid, which is always nice for me. And even though my kids tell me that Fortnite is dead, an average game of Fortnite still lasts about like 15, 20 minutes for the millions of people who still play Fortnite. And when it comes to reading and sort of gathering information, we certainly live in a too long didn't read culture, TLDR, too long didn't read. We want people to summarize things for us, right? And there's actually research that shows that we're training our brains, especially when we read in digital environments, to skip over the second half of paragraphs. Because a lot of times now in writing, certainly online, certainly in most writing, the first couple sentences of a paragraph will show us the core idea, and the second couple sentences in the paragraph are sort of supplementary information. And we learn, and we're like, okay, that's the main idea. I'm just going to skip to the next thing because we need to move fast. We have to consume so much information. I don't know if any of you are still on Twitter. I'm still occasionally there, but certainly on Twitter and on Mastodon, I see people putting posts about, good but long articles that we're supposed to read, as if the two are now somehow mutually exclusive. And yeah, it is a little bit frightening, Mary, but the reality is it's what we've learned to do to time optimize, because our time is so precious. We want information faster and we want it in bite-sized chunks. But the primary way in which information at, certainly higher education, where I work, or community events or work conferences is transmitted, even here today, hasn't really changed in a very long time, right? There's a person presenting for long blocks of time. And this runs up against the way in which we, and certainly our audiences, when we present to community partners, parents, schools, whatever, the way in which they're receiving that information. Our expectations about how we receive information and shape time have changed, but the way in which we deliver condensed information in presentations to community partners or the public largely has not. And so this usually makes presentations pretty boring, right? This is you in about an hour or maybe even 15 minutes, or certainly by the end of the day when you've been on Zoom for 6 or 7 hours. It is really tough to do, right? It can be very disengaging. So how do we combat that, right? Or maybe we shouldn't be doing lectures at all or presentations at all. But I like to think that presentations are still important. Presentations are valuable because they allow us to distill the most important things our audience needs to know, the most important messages that we have, and some data and some contextual information into meaningful chunks without making them wade through encyclopedic readings or books. They help our audiences, our colleagues, our project partners know what is important, right? So before I move any further, and I'm going to ask some questions throughout. You can unmute yourself. You can type in the text chat, however you want to answer. Please just go ahead and answer, because a little interaction goes a long way in keeping your audience engaged. And I'll talk about that later. So let me just stop for a second and ask you the question, since I'm talking about them. For you, when you are at a conference like this, or at work, or at a community partner briefing, what makes for a good presentation? What makes for a good presentation that you've sat through, either in education, in your work life? What makes for a good presentation? Let's see. All right, excellent. People are responding. Barry says interactivity. Yes. Katie says engaging speaker. Barbara says interaction, more people, interaction. Not reading the slides. Humor. Humor is really tough. Humor is very, very challenging because not everyone is funny. I'm a deeply unfunny person myself. And learning how to be funny is really, really hard. But right, energy, responding to chat, nice
relevant
visuals.
information.
Yeah, sharing knowledge, information that's relevant to you as a human being. Totally. Interaction, open discussion, video, dynamic speaker. Wow, you are like the most responsive group I've given this presentation to in a really, really long time. This is great. And Lee says, tell the story well and make sure there's at least one thing to learn. Totally agree with all of that. Positive conversation, positive atmosphere, personal story, repetition. Ellen's already seen my presentation. Repetition, no, yeah, absolutely, 100%. These, I think, are all great techniques for great presentations. The question is, how do we do that? Right? It's easy to say, oh, be engaging and connect with your audience and tell a good story. But how do we actually do that stuff? And that's what I want to try to talk about today. I'm really here to talk about increasing audience engagement and retention of information by using techniques from the movies, or theater, or play, or books, or epic poetry. These narrative techniques have been around for a long time, and my goal here is to get you to think a little bit differently about designing and delivering presentations, whether they're short 5-minute ones or an hour-and-a-half long presentations, no matter what it is. And I'm not going to argue that presentations are the best method to reach people, but they're really common in the work that we do. We're given a short amount of time, we're asked to present, and then do kind of a Q&A. They're everywhere. They serve a purpose. Let's figure out how we can make them better, right? How we can keep our audiences engaged, especially non-expert audiences who may not have a vested interest in what we're talking about, and ideally want them to get to know more and remember more later on afterwards. Because that's if you give a great presentation, that's cool, but if nobody remembers it later on, that's a problem, right? You want to instigate behavior change. You want to make sure that you can engage your audiences. So that's really what I'm here to talk about today. the next 45 minutes or so. And this is what I teach about as well. I teach about communication largely through things like presentations, podcasts, elevator pitches, and then also data visualization to non-expert audiences at the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins. But before I get to all that, just a little bit about me and my background. So many years ago, as you can tell from the gray, when I was in college, I had 3 career goals. I was in the theater, not an actor. I'm a terrible actor, but I'm a pretty good director, bossing people around, telling them what to do. Not really, just creating a safe space in which they can try and fail is really what I learned to do. And I had 3 career goals back then. I was going to work in the regional theater circuit. I was going to run my own theater company, and I was going to direct on Broadway. And I managed to achieve 2 of those 3 goals. I worked in the regional theater circuit for a while, and I ran my own professional theater company for about a decade. And then in the economic bubble burst of 2001, 2002, post 9/11, a lot of arts organizations went under. And that was really because a lot of funding that went normally to arts organizations wound up going to 9/11 charities. My theater disappeared after 10 years of my life. And I don't look at that as like 10 years of my life I'll never get back. Not at all. It was super important and super valuable to me. And it's really shaped everything that I have done since then. And it's really led me to these kind of 2 core principles when it comes to teaching, when it comes to presenting, when it comes to interactivity, and sharing knowledge with other people. And the first of those 2 principles is that learning is narrative. Learning is storytelling. We take our audience, whether it's a group of professionals or a group of parents or whoever it might be, from one understanding of the world to another when we present. We lead them on a journey from point A to point B to point C with a shell of a script, some kind of script there. And when we teach, we are telling them a story, and that story changes the way our audience understands how they interact with the world. Through that story, they have a different understanding of who they are and where they sort of exist in position to everything around them, maybe in small ways, maybe in large ways, but it changes the way in which they sort of interact with the world. And narrative itself gives meaning to facts. Facts by themselves may be interesting, but it takes narrative, it takes that sort of storytelling connective tissue to give meaning to those facts in a way that most people can understand, and certainly non-expert audiences can understand. I would even argue expert audiences, because if you don't tell a story and you're just dumping facts to a bunch of grad students, they're not going to see how all the pieces fit together. Narrative is the context. It's the story that tells your audience why something's important. It hopefully keeps them engaged and gets them to want to know more, ideally, later on. And narrative itself, the act of storytelling, shapes processing, retention, desire. How we tell is as important as what we tell. It has a measurable impact on information processing. Neuroscience for the last 20, 25 years, since the invention of the fMRI, has shown that different parts of our brain light up when we tell stories versus simply stating information. And the 4 different phases of how we create memory, there's basically 4 phases: attention, encoding, storage, and retrieval. Those first 2 phases of attention and encoding are directly affected by how information is fed into our brain. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And sensory and emotional cues themselves shape narrative and our processing of narrative. This is a really important point, and there's lots of research on how sensory and emotional cues shape our processing information and our understanding of narrative. And there's lots of research on this. So the shape of a space can absolutely affect us. We've all sat in work conference rooms or in lecture halls or in school gymnasiums on really uncomfortable seats, right? And your butt falls asleep after 10 minutes, and you're like, all you can think about is like, I'm not very comfortable here. Regardless of how engaging the speaker is, you're focused more on the discomfort of your body. Or if you're in a cramped space where you're elbowing people who are sitting next to you, that's absolutely going to affect your ability to focus and pay attention. Color is really important in terms of sensory and emotional cues and how we remember things, or what our behavior is. This is why fast food restaurants, for example, use light, bright white colors mostly, because they want to turn tables really fast. It's also about hygiene and making things look clean and good. But it's mostly about getting people in and out with sort of a high energy environment versus and more upscale restaurants use muted colors because they want you to sit for a while and buy another drink, because that's how most restaurants make their money, is not on food, but on alcohol. Sound is super important in terms of how we process narrative, particularly when we're talking about things like movies or TV shows, right? It takes two notes in the movie Jaws to establish a main villain, narrative drive, and serious dramatic tension. And if you've seen the movie Jaws, you're probably familiar with those two notes. They open the movie, they're used all the time, right? And you think about those notes and you're like, oh, it reminds you of why you never want to go in the water again, right? But that's it. You hear it and you're like, okay, I'm going to die by the shark. Yeah, Mike, Jaws is like one of my top 5 movies. Totally. And Barry, you're right. Grocery store music is there to get people to relax and calm down and to buy more stuff, right? If you relax, you're going to wander the aisles, you're going to buy more stuff. So psychology has shown us that we're engaged by and more likely to remember things that appeal to multiple senses. So if we can tie into our limbic system, that's the sort of down here near our brainstem, this is our sort of core emotional memory center. If we can tie into our limbic system with information that we're sharing with our audience, we can get them to remember things not just for 5 minutes or 5 hours, but 5 months or 5 years. And that's really, really powerful. So the other sort of principle that I work from is that design is important. The look and feel of things is important. How things are laid out on your slides is important. It tells a story as much as your content. We largely organize our emotional experience with narrative, with storytelling around visual cues. It's been, I guess, 25, maybe 26 years now, but I can still remember in Titanic, the ship breaks apart and there's this great cacophony of noise, and the one side sinking and the other side is starting to sink. It bobs up and down. There's all this noise as the ship's going down, and Jack's yelling at Rose, don't let go, don't let go. And there's, after all this noise, there's this dead silence. And there's this amazing tracking shot of that James Cameron, the director, puts in there, where after all this noise and all this chaos, he pulls back and he starts on the sort of flat black waters of the North Atlantic Sea, and he pulls back, and you see people and you see more people, and eventually there are hundreds and thousands of people kicking and screaming and dying in this flat black water, and it still affects me 25 years later. So Hollywood spends billions of dollars a year to manipulate us through the full spectrum of design techniques they have at their disposal. That's what it's about. It's about manipulating us. I mean, we don't realize this, right? Sometimes if we think about it, think about Avengers Infinity War, right? For anyone who saw Infinity War, right? What's the story of Avengers Infinity War? Just think about it for a second. And if you really think about it, you could basically boil the story down to man collects stones. That was the story of Avengers Infinity War, but that's not the way we remember that, right? That's not the way we remember it, because we were being manipulated through this full spectrum of design techniques to create something that was a lot more emotional, a lot more powerful, a lot more engaging. We live in a design-attuned world, right? Look at these things, right? These devices are very much about design. Target Boutique, built its empire in the early 2000s with the motto, design for everyone. Right? And it's not just the things we touch or the clothes we wear or the phones that we use, but it's also the interfaces through which we interact that are super important. Donald Norman, is a very famous human-computer interaction expert. And in his seminal work from 2002, Attractive Things Work Better is the name of the title. You don't need to read it because the title pretty much tells you everything you need to know. He basically talks about and shows that when we see things that appear attractive to us, it encourages creative thinking, right? So we've all worked with systems or user interfaces that are difficult to work with, federal user interfaces, state user interfaces for data collection, reporting, paying your taxes, car tickets, whatever it is. They're really frustrating. And you're like, I'm not going to be creative about this. I just got to get through this because it's so painful to use. So we need to think about every slide in our presentation as a user interface that our audience has to learn and process. And we want to keep that processing to a minimum so our audience can focus and make those creative connections and narrative connections that we want them to make when we present. Because we're not all great natural born storytellers. But we are expected, as you were saying, many of you were saying before, to entertain, right? Use humor, hold our audience's attention at conferences or with community partners. And we're not all great natural storytellers, but there are ways that we can present and structure information which facilitates that storytelling process. And that's what I'm going to talk about. Because I think we need to treat every presentation we make like a Hollywood production with Hollywood production values, not content values. That's a different story entirely. We need to think about how we direct and design our production, because this has impact on our audience's ability to process, retain, and synthesize information for problem solving or behavior change later on. Because if all you do, honestly, if all you do is just post your PowerPoint the same way that you ever did, you have walked into what I think is the biggest trap in presenting. And certainly in higher education, it's a huge trap in public health. It's a huge trap in communicating with non-expert audiences. This is a trap. It makes it easy to dump information very quickly, but not effectively. It's a trap, as Admiral Akbar would say. So anyone know off the top of your head, when you go into PowerPoint and you click that new slide button, anyone know what the basic, what the default template for PowerPoint is when you click on that new slide button? Anyone want to try it in the text chat? When you click new slide, what comes up on the screen? It's boring. Yes, absolutely. But like, what's the default content? Blank title, right? So if you go into PowerPoint, you haven't changed to anything else. The default for PowerPoint is title and bullets. So what did you see your entire high school career, undergraduate career, certainly, when you watched lectures and presentations? Title and bullets. Title and bullets. Grad school, for those of you who went to grad school, title and bullets. I see it every day at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. You probably see it in most of the meetings you go to. Title and bullets, right? Title and bullets everywhere you go. And this is a phenomenon in psychology known as functional fixedness. We use things in the way that are first presented to us. So PowerPoint says title and bullets. So that's what we do over and over and over again, even though it doesn't facilitate storytelling, even though it is information dumping and doesn't really allow you to think critically and constructively about the best way to communicate that information. All right, I'm going to take a little pause here. Another question for you, because I want to shift gears away from talking about PowerPoint and me and my background, all this stuff. Another question for you. And again, feel free to unmute yourself or type in the text chat. When you're watching a movie or you're watching a TV show on HBO Max or Netflix or Disney or whatever you're watching, or reading a book or watching a play, what makes a good story? What are the elements of a good narrative, of a good story? What makes you want to continue watching a 16-episode series on Netflix or a 2.5-hour movie or something like that? Okay, Linda, intrigue, conflict, suspense. A lot of people saying suspense, twists and turns, not super predictable, interesting characters, the plot, the hero, surprise twists, emotion, good main character. Nuance, I like that, Joey, nuance, that you can relate, right? You can relate to that person or the people on the screen. Drama makes you think, deep characters, suspense, story flow, connection to the characters, plot. Crime, Kim's all about the crime, that's good. Amber says good twists. Comedy, right? Who doesn't love a good comedy? I love myself some Ted Lasso. When my friends told me about it, I was like, I'm not going to watch that. Show about soccer. Who wants to watch that? Lightsabers. You've got an entire streaming platform dedicated to you, Joey, with lightsabers, pretty much. Right. So connecting with the audience, conflict, interesting characters. Absolutely. These are all elements of good stories. And this is, I think really what good presenting ultimately is about. And I'm going to spend the majority of the rest of my time talking about techniques from film and stage to make more engaging presentations and increasing information retention over time. And again, these techniques have been used for thousands of years in theater, in books, in plays, in movies, and TV now. They really just work. And I'm not going to say that after today, you're going to have to apply every single one of these techniques I talk about to your presentations, but think about how you might be able to introduce one or two of them. And I think it will make a significant difference in audience engagement and information retention, because you're providing multiple points from which an audience can connect to you as a presenter and to your content in a relatable, humane kind of way, because all of these things are ultimately about people and how we connect with people. All right. So first up is conflict. Since a bunch of people said like conflict, drama, plot twists, all that stuff, absolutely. Conflict, number one. Conflict is the cornerstone of narrative. Narrative without conflict is boring. Jaws without the shark would be a day on Nantucket, which is lovely and beautiful, but kind of boring. Who's going to sit and watch the ocean for 2.5 hours on screen? Nobody, right? So ask the question, always posit the question, what is the obstacle that needs to be overcome? What do we need to do? What's the problem, right? What stories can you tell about something that you experienced or something that you know happened that will frame the issue you're talking about through conflict? Conflict drives engagement. It creates meaning for your audience and creates a very simple structure for your presentation, right? So you have problem, discussion, and then sort of resolution, solution, if there's a solution, right? So position problems in the foreground and show how you can overcome them, or in the case of problems that can't be resolved or perhaps intractable or endemic, what needs to be worked on. But always find, show the problems up front, super important. Next up, character. And a lot of people mentioned this when I asked the question about what makes for good stories. Characters, people, right? So when I started working at the Bloomberg School of Public Health many years ago, I didn't know much about public health, believe it or not. I know slightly more now, just only slightly. And the inimitable Marie Diener West, who's a faculty member of great renown at Bloomberg, explained to me that public health is about people. It's about populations, right? Medicine is generally about persons, one-on-one. Public health is about people, populations. Well, cool. Public health is about people. Well, nanobiotechnology is about people. Economics is about people. Statistics is about people. Art history is about people. Addiction and drug use abatement and alcoholism, these are all about people. Everything is about people. So find ways of talking about people, yourself, people you've worked with, cases you've studied, whatever it is, bring those into your stories, into your presentations. Because from the time we are infants, we affix on faces. We affix on people. We can connect with people really easily. This is why TV shows, books, movies are about ultimately people. And even if they're about animals or in Disney movies or about robots or whatever, they are fully anthropomorphized so that we can connect with them as human beings. They don't look quite like cars or fish or robots. They look like people, right? This is why they're designed that way. So we can affix to them, because that is what we do as human beings. We automatically are drawn to faces. We are automatically drawn to the stories of others. Because for lasting effect when you present, you have to persuade the rational brain, right? That something is correct and factual. But you also need to resonate with the emotional brain. When it comes to things like, for example, policy, governmental policy, public health policy, federal policy, state policy, these are complex things, really, really complex things. And the vast majority of people don't necessarily have the knowledge and the skills to focus on and understand policy and all of its nuance and detail. So people trust or believe based on emotional instinct. So if you can tap into that emotional instinct, if you can tell stories that are meaningful and relevant to them, they will believe you, they will buy into what you're saying, they'll be more engaged, because we always focus on people. So tell stories about the people behind the research, tell stories about the people behind the policy, around the discoveries, whatever it is you're talking about. Tell a story about a person, even if it's a short story, it'll make a huge difference in your audience's engagement. All right, next up, pace. Pace is maybe the most important tool that a director has in their arsenal for shaping narrative and the emotional experience. This is a key tool in maintaining audience engagement. Pace. How quickly you speak is part of that. I'm a fast talker. Not everyone has to be a fast talker. Sometimes I talk too fast, but it's more about structuring and organizing your content in a meaningful way. So just like acts in a play, like our good friend Shakespeare with his 5-act play structure, or a movie script. Movie scripts have acts. If you've ever noticed, they sort of have a 3-act structure as well. We need to chunk our content into logical and obvious sections. Chunk our content into logical and obvious sections, even if it's like a 5-minute presentation. Figure out where those section breaks are, because people need to know they're moving forward. People need to have a sense of motion, of journey, of progress. Because if you're just sort of going on and on and on and on and on, there's no sense of forward motion. People are like, what is this about? Where are we going? When are we going to get there? And there's a lot of research on this. So for example, the US Navy did a study of commissioned officers, so these people who had been through, the sort of basics and boot camp. And they wanted to know, in a learning environment, how long can an audience sort of sit still, these commissioned officers, these people who are literally trained to be high focus for long periods of time, because this could be a life or death situation. How long can they sit in a classroom? How long can they sit in front of a presenter and actually pay attention without having significant mind wandering or loss of information retention? Anyone want to guess how long they could sit in an environment not unlike this and pay attention without having mind wandering and loss of information retention? Any guesses? 5 minutes, Ellen says. 10, 30, 45, 20. Yeah. So the naval study, and again, this is commissioned officers, not so quite sort of 3 minutes, 18 minutes, 18 minutes. And that study was done in 1974. So you can imagine with these devices and everything else, that number goes way down. And John Medina, who's a researcher, a biologist out of University of Washington, did research on this more recently back in 2016. And he showed that it was about 10 minutes, before there was significant mind wandering and lack of information retention, even among his best grad students who are like 4.0, super driven. So we've got to make sure that we chunk our content into logical sections so people know that we are making progress. And when it comes to the individual slide, well, people say, well, how long should I spend on a slide? Well, I would say about 2 minutes. 2 minutes is about the most you want to spend on a slide. And the reason I say that, well, there's two reasons. One, we've all sat in presentations where, you know, it's like the person talks about the same slide for 15 minutes and you're just like, please, I've read everything you're saying everything that's on the slide. So let's just move on to something else, right? But as Ellen mentioned earlier, I do work in a group called the Center for Teaching and Learning. We do a lot of statistics and analytics on how students like watch presentations, particularly pre-recorded ones for online classes. And we find that most students will wind up skipping ahead after about 2 minutes of being on an individual slide. In part, it's because too many people put title and bullets and read off of their slides, but also because they get bored. They want forward motion. So this is about creating ultimately a faster pace through your presentation, right? We all know a boring, slow moving book or movie is really hard to be engaged with. So you got to keep that sense of forward motion, and chunking your content in the logical sections will really help do that as well. All right, next up, composition. Yeah, so if you put an image in and talk about it, Barry, for 2 minutes, that's fine. You know, it really depends on however you need to be as clear and concise as possible. I'll talk about editing in a minute here, but yeah, you can have just an image on the slide for 2 minutes and talk about it. That works. It could be 30 seconds. It could be 10 seconds, whatever time you need to get your key point about that moment in the presentation across. I just sort of shy away from anything longer than about 2-3 minutes, because then you do start losing your audience's attention. All right, composition. So this is a bit more like practical stuff, like I talked about storytelling. Composition is important. And this is really about how we can lay out our slides to help our audiences focus on the right piece of information at the right time and not make them have to decipher or figure out what they should be looking at, because composition is important. How we read slides does affect our ability to process and remember information later on, because there is a sort of standard way that we in the West review information in digital spaces, not so much in books, but certainly on screens, whether they're small screens or laptop screens or giant screens in an auditorium or lecture hall. There is a way that we read, and there's a natural sort of pattern that it occurs. And we in the West read in an F-shaped pattern, the letter F as in frog. Jacob Nielsen, another very well-known human-computer interaction expert, works with Donald Norman, has done research on this. So in 2006, he released his first study showing that we, especially on screens, PowerPoint, the web, read in an F-shaped pattern. He repeated the study in 2012, again in 2016, and he repeated it again last year. It's the same trends, the same pattern. So we start in the upper left corner of the screen. We read over, we read down, we read over a little, and we read down straight from there. So we read in this F-shaped pattern. And we do this consciously or subconsciously because this is how we've sort of trained ourselves to look at screens. Anyone want to guess why we don't really pay attention much to the sort of right side of screens? We start in the left. I mean, obviously we read from left to right, but why we don't really focus on the right side of screens? Anyone want to take a wild guess? What's most common if you're looking at websites?
Ads.
Ads. Yes, Joey, thank you. Yes, ads, right? That's where ads mostly go. So we sort of learn to ignore the right side of the screen because it's mostly extraneous stuff and we're looking primarily on the left. And of course, advertisers have now figured this out, and that's why they're putting ads like in the middle of like the text, right? You read an article in the New York Times or Washington Post, and it's right there in the middle, along with 15 other pop-ups. But the point is that there is this natural hierarchy to how we read things on the screen. So if you're using bullet lists, which I would not recommend that you do, and your most important point is the last thing on that screen at the bottom of the F, you are diminishing the power and memorability of that item. Break apart your bullet list, put them on separate slides. Everything will be more memorable that way. So the point here is you got to think about how we organize information on screen, right? How we organize and how we're going to show the right piece of information at the right time to our audience. This is a really cool, beautifully hand-drawn mind map about decluttering and organizing your life, right? But if I want to say, okay, take a look where on the mind map where it talks about, overvalued items. Well, then you've got to like, okay, you got to look at this whole thing and I'm still talking and you're not paying attention to me because you're scanning this entire thing over and over again, looking for the word overvalued, right? It's like, I mean, overlooked. I said overlooked. It's complex. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's a monkey, there's a non-scary clown, there's a penguin. It's too much though. It's too much. So if you want to talk about decluttering and organizing, for me, this is a lot more effective. It's simple. It's clean. It has a little bit of emotional resonance because that poor little box is by itself in the lower right corner of the screen where we don't normally look. So when it comes to our visuals and our visual presentations, less is more. Certainly for non-expert audiences, less is more. We often do put everything that our audience needs to know, or worse yet, that we might need to say on our slides. That may be convenient for us, but it absolutely negatively affects pace and audience focus. I've heard this referred to as the toxicity of information overload. We've all seen it. We've all been there. A slide with like tons of data, or a table that has like 15 columns and 37 rows on one slide, or complex visualizations that are just impossible to process without serious, intense focus that completely pulls you away from your presenter. You know, cognitive science shows us, and has shown us time and again, that too much information negatively impacts attention and certainly negatively impacts processing. And this is most common, and we've all seen it, and I've done it myself, certainly from time to time, when it comes to reading off of our slides, right? We read off of our slides. And look, we all read faster than we talk. I mean, I'm a fast talker, but any of you and pretty much anyone I present to in an expert or non-expert setting will read faster than I am able to speak. We need to stop reading our slides. Simple as that. Because if everything an audience needs to know is on your slides, then why do you need to be there? Why do you need to present? Slides are a visual reinforcement to what you as the presenter are saying. And if you're dumping data, table, chart, table, chart, table, chart, why is that not a document that you give out to your audience rather than being given as a presentation? And absolutely, Ellen, I'll 100% agree with you. It is rude when presenters read from their slides. It's rude. I don't like saying it, but Ellen did, so I will follow up on that. It is insulting to your audience, and it is not a good use of their time. Give them the document. Seriously. Cancel the meeting, cancel the presentation, save the literally hundreds of hours that all those people in the room are going to be wasting by you talking when reading off of your slides. And I know this is hard to do. I know this is terrifying to do because people are like, well, I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to mess up. How am I going to remember what I'm going to say? I'll tell you what, notes. Slide notes are awesome. Slide notes are the best thing ever. I rely on my slide notes over and over and over again. I'm doing it to this today. I've given this presentation 100+ times, and I still look at my slide notes. Leave the textual detail to your slide notes. Leave those quotations, the citations, the specific years, the specific data points, leave them in the slide notes. And yeah, Effie, slide notes changed my life. It frees you from having to read from the screen. And what's great is that you can then give those notes in your handouts or the PowerPoint file or the Keynote file or the PDF, whatever you're giving after the fact to your audience. So they have the citations, they have the links, they have the details without having to be bogged down by all that visual processing and information overload, or worse yet, you reading from your slides when you present. And by the way, if you're using font sizes less than 36 point, you're doing it wrong. Let me repeat that. If you're using font sizes less than 36 point, you're doing it wrong. I mean, on Zoom, it's a little bit different because you have the screen right in front of you. But if you're in an auditorium or lecture hall or conference, whatever it is, those small text things, we can't read that. I can't read that, man. I wear glasses like many of you. I'm getting older. I can't see the small text. And what happens when you have that small text? You're like, what? And you're not paying attention to the speaker. You're breaking out of the moment. You're struggling to figure out and read what's going on. And again, every slide is just bits and bytes. There are behaviors that are carried over from a time when everybody printed everything out, right? And, I'd say prior to about 2005, 2010, 2005, people printed so much stuff, handouts, print all this stuff out. And you wanted to save ink. So you would put everything on one slide. Well, you don't need to do that. Put each bullet, if you're gonna use bullets, on a separate slide, provide some contextual information, but put each bullet on its own slide so your audience isn't reading ahead of you. And you're helping them see the right piece of information at the right time. So usually at this point, people are like, okay, so Brian says, don't put anything on your slides, only use images, never put any data on there. No data. Data is important. Data is critical. It's compelling, whether you're an expert or non-expert audiences. People need data, 100%. But we also, as presenters, need to be critical about how much data we choose to show. We need to help our audience focus on the right piece of data at the right time. And we can clarify our message, make it more meaningful and clear to our audience by simplifying our presentation. Again, you don't have to use the bullets. You can split it apart. But most importantly, edit ruthlessly. And this is hard, right? Like, you're like, well, I should add in this and this thing and this. No. When in doubt, leave it out. When you practice and you're like, boy, this is going on for a long time. Yes, it is. Cut it out. Unless you're doing basically a PhD dissertation defense, your audience does not need encyclopedic knowledge and tangents and that little supplementary information. They don't. And this is hard to do. This is super hard to do. All great directors suffer from the too much syndrome, right? Martin Scorsese, for any of you who saw like The Irishman, 3.5 hours long, man. 3.5 hour long movie. It could have been like 3 hour and 10-minute episodes. It could like a mini series. It would have been great. But sitting through 3.5 hours, it was too much. And I'm not trying to disparage Scorsese. He's amazing. I could never do in my entire life what he's accomplished in his career. But all great directors and writers, George R.R. Martin, Game of Thrones, right? Too much. We need an editor. When in doubt, leave it out. And we can use PowerPoint or Keynote or Prezi or whatever you're using as a camera to help reduce complexity, to help us process the story and not the presentation of the story by drilling down and pulling out key data points in complex visuals that we need to share with our audience. And let me give you some examples of that. So this is a slide from a presentation that a colleague of mine, Gil Burnham, gave on the causes of famine in the Horn of Africa. And there's a lot of stuff going on here, right? We've got multiple axes, multiple labels on the axes, which I never recommend doing, but there's lots of data points on this sort of slippery slope that he's talking about here. So where do you look first, right? If I said, okay, take a look at where they sold off or consumed their large animals. Again, you have to do a lot of scanning on here. You got to be like, wait, where is he talking about? You're not listening to me as a presenter. We've broken the focus. We've broken that storytelling. So instead, what we can do is we can focus on less data at any point in time to help see the story more clearly. So all Gil did here was he presented the whole thing, but when he wanted to talk about specific items, he zoomed in just by blowing up the image inside a PowerPoint. And so by highlighting the different phases of this process, we more clearly see how a series of choices ultimately leads to tragedy. And if we want to highlight a specific item, all we do is add in a very simple PowerPoint animation. So you don't have to worry about finding where it says 8 wild foods. I'm doing that work for you. These kind of animations are so simple. They take seconds to add in, and they make a huge difference in keeping the audience in the moment, in the flow, without breaking it and then going, wait, where am I looking? What did I miss? They know exactly what they're seeing when you add a super simple animation like that into it. So by focusing on less data at any point in time, we ultimately see the story more clearly. And you can do circles or highlights. You can even use negative space, overlays, to say, here's the rest of the information in context, but this is what I want you to focus on here. And you can, again, simple PowerPoint shapes are super powerful when we're dealing with visualizations of any different kind. So if I want to focus on, say, the year 1987, I can use a simple circle to focus on where things converge in 87, or I can use a square to highlight the entire year and all the different series and the points where they enter or they intersect at that year. I can also, again, use negative space to show the context of everything else, but kind of push it in the background. And these are simple overlays that are super easy to do. Same thing with tables. Instead of trying to use a laser pointer, never use a laser pointer. Won't go into that rant. Use simple semi-transparent overlays. They're easy to do, and they make it so much easier for your audience to follow along in visualizations. And again, use those tools built into PowerPoint to help show the right detail at the right time, because that will clarify your message and make you a more compelling speaker and to your audience as well. Super easy to use. Please start using them. Please add them in. Okay. So I've rambled on for a while, and at this point, you're probably thinking, cool, this is great, but how do I actually do this? How do I actually put this into practice? I mean, the visual stuff with like less on the slides and breaking apart bullet lists and using animations, fine, whatever. But how about that story about stuff about character and conflict and stories? How do I do that, right? I'm not a theater person. I don't know. How do I do that? Well, I'll give you an answer to that question. How do you do that? Through narrative frameworks. And I'd like to spend the last sort of 5 minutes of my time or 7 minutes of my time talking about the Pixar storytelling framework. Because the Pixar storytelling framework, like most narrative frameworks, will help you structure your ideas. And it's really particularly powerful when you want to talk about why something works well, why an intervention works well. You're pitching a new public health campaign. You're talking about a new private-public partnership and why this will work. The Pixar storytelling framework works really well in these and many other situations. And ultimately, the Pixar storytelling framework and most narrative frameworks focus on something known as story spine. What's the key structuring of our narrative, of our presentation, of our story that gets our ideas across in the most compelling and simple way? So the Pixar storytelling framework came out of some writing by Emma Coates. Emma Coates was a lead storyboard artist at Pixar for about 20 years. So back from the time of the original Toy Story, all the way up through, I think she left around about 5-6 years ago. So that would be like around after Toy Story 4, I think is when she left. Anyways, so she was both a writer. She sort of was like a story, the people who sort of oversee the scripts and the stories. And she was also the lead storyboard artist. So she's the one who was responsible for the utterly crushing and devastating opening sequence to Up, known as Married Life, where in 5 minutes, they completely ruin your life through this beautiful story of the main character and his wife and their life they did and did not have. It's considered by many to be one of the great storytelling achievements of the 20th and 21st century, the last 100 years. You all know it. If you've seen it, you know it. It's ultimately crushing. And so she wrote about how Pixar goes about developing their stories. And these have sort of been distilled since then, and in conversations with her, into a basic structure for all of Pixar's movies. And the structure goes like this, and it will probably become very clear to you once I go through it. So once upon a time, and every day, until one day, and because of this, and because of that, until finally, right? The happiest and saddest introduction ever. Absolutely, Jasmine. So this is the Pixar storytelling framework. So what does this mean? What are we talking about here? And I apologize for reading, but I'm going to do a little bit of it here. So once upon a time is the context of the world, where we are, basic context story. And every day there are things that happen in that world in a very kind of quotidian, repeated way. And then something happens that launches the story. There's an incident, something launches that story. And then the characters go on a journey. And during that journey, they learn something and they take a slightly different journey until there is a resolution of that story. And again, every single Pixar movie from Toy Story through, was it Turning Red this year was the last film they did? They all follow this outline. And let me just show you it at work in one of my favorite Pixar movies, which I've watched hundreds of times with my children, and that's Finding Nemo. So once upon a time, there was a fish named Marlin who was protective of his son Nemo. And Marlin warned Nemo that the world was full of danger, right? Because in the beginning, his mom got killed by the barracuda, until one day, Nemo ignored his dad and swam into the sea and touched the butt. And because of that, he was captured by a diver and ended up in a fish tank. And because of that, Marlin swam across the ocean to find Nemo, until finally, Marlin found Nemo and learned that love depends on trust. So that's the Pixar storytelling framework at work. And again, look at any of the movies, WALL-E, Incredibles, whatever it is, this is the basic storytelling framework for all of Pixar's films and their success. So what does this have to do with public health, right? Or substance abuse intervention, or whatever it is? Well, the great thing about storytelling frameworks like this is they can be applied to lots of different situations, especially when you got to get up and talk in front of people to present an idea, or a drug use reduction program or a mental health services campaign to them, whatever it is. This has huge applicability to public health and giving you a simple storytelling framework that you can use from this point moving forward. So here's how it would be applied in the public health context. So once upon a time, you talk about the problem. Then you talk about current solutions and why they don't work, until one day you come along with your solution, your campaign, your intervention, this policy program that went into effect that changed millions of lives. And because of that, you talk about why your solution is going to be better. And then because of that, you talk about why your solution will work or how it worked, until finally you get some kind of desired outcome. This is a great framework, especially for pitching and talking about, like I said, interventions, new programs. But again, you can use it to talk about how John Snow founded modern epidemiology, right? You could use it for the same way. So let me give you a quick example about how we might use this in an example sort of public health topic, and what I like to talk about because I see my students talking about it a lot, and that's antibiotic resistance. So once upon a time, we live in a world where you get antibiotics pretty much every time you go to the doctor. You get a rash or a cut, there's a lot of antibiotics being prescribed around, and every day, because of that, antimicrobial bacteria are on the rise. And here's the data to prove it. This would be a great point to introduce charts, tables, graphs, great opportunity to say, here's what's going on in the world. Until one day, you come up with a two-pronged strategy for reducing antibiotic overprescription, as well as developing new antibiotics through public-private partnerships, because there's very few pharmaceutical companies doing new antibiotic research work. So because of this strategy that you described, there's not only going to be a reduction in antibiotic-resistant microbes, there's also going to be an increased funding for new antibiotic research. And because of that, there's going to be better health outcomes for people and better incentives for private research, because public-private partnerships work, until finally we have generations of new antibiotics and we can live without fear of paper cuts killing us anymore. So that's a very rough sort of idea of how the Pixar storytelling framework can work within a public health context, within an example for that. It's really powerful. I will make sure you get a copy of these slides so you have that sort of table that you can try with your own presentations. Try it once, see how it goes, how you might frame one of your stories, how you might frame one of your presentations to non-experts or even expert audiences, how you might be pitching a new intervention or campaign. Try it out. It is extraordinarily powerful and provides great structure because it has storytelling, it has drama, it has character, it has conflict, it has reflection, it has all the great elements of good or even great stories built right in. All right. So everything I talked about today, and I'm going to wrap up here shortly. All of this does not work if you don't practice and rehearse all of your presentations. None of this works. None of this that I'm talking about works without preparation and rehearsal. People ask me a lot, well, what makes it good for a good presentation? I asked you, what makes for a good presentation earlier today? Rehearsal. The key to good, not even great presentations is rehearsal. Presenting is a skill. It's like a muscle. You've got to work it. You've got to work it out. You've got to strengthen it over time. Simply getting up in front of an audience after you type a bunch of stuff onto slides does not mean you'll be a good presenter. You've got to practice. You won't hear the crazy, malformed, misshapen things that come out of your mouth if you don't practice, right? You'll know also that your content fits your time. How many times have you sat in presentations where it's like the person races through the end or says, well, I've got 15 more slides, but I'm out of time. Well, you'll know that your content can fit the time if you practice. Great presenters who are great storytellers didn't get that way without practicing each and every story, each and every presentation. You might see comedians doing stand-up specials. John Mulaney has a new one on Netflix this weekend. Chris Rock, Bo Burnham, whoever it is. They are not funny people naturally. They practice each joke, they try out each joke, they tell each story in comedy clubs and basements all across the country, and they fail, and they fail, and they fail until they figure out, that worked, or that worked. And that becomes the presentation that you see on Netflix or HBO, or when you go to see them live and in person. They are not great storytellers. They get that way through practice and repetition. Because sure, yeah, you can dump a bunch of information into your slides the last minute, which is what PowerPoint, of course, lets you do. But it's not going to be a great presentation. And you can't just think it in your head. You got to get up. You got to say things out loud. And rehearsal breeds confidence. We are all terrified. We're terrified of presenting. I give this presentation a lot. I teach presenting. I get up in front of people, whether it's 5 or 500 people, or even on Zoom, I get nervous. I get worried. But confidence will come through rehearsal and repetition and practice. You won't be as nervous. You won't be terrified that something will go wrong or someone will ask you a tough question. Rehearsal breeds confidence, and that makes for great presentations. All right. Going to wrap up real quick with just a couple of resources I'd like to leave with around becoming a better designer, because that's really hard. I'm not a designer at all. I have no good aesthetic sense. I stand on the shoulders of others, but there's some resources I'd like to share with you that I think are really useful in terms of becoming a better presenter and creating more interesting sort of slides as well. There's a book that I teach from in one of my classes called Better Presentations. It's by Jonathan Schwabish. Highly recommend it. Highly, highly. This is a great book written by an academic who works in the public policy space about, how to be a better presenter, how to use color right, or effective information design, data visualization. If you're interested in all the research, he quotes all the research from the last 70 years around color and learning theory and design theory and all this stuff about what works and what doesn't. It's kind of an academic book, but it's also a great and pretty fast read that has a lot of very valuable, very practical, good advice on being a better presenter and creating better presentations as well. And the other thing I would say is, if you really want to stand out in your professional work as a presenter, use a professional template. Everybody sees the same PowerPoint templates over and over and over and over again. You want to make your slides stand out, aside from just the stories you might be telling and the way you engage your audience, use a professional template. These things cost anywhere from $5 to $25. You can get a lot of them at Graphic River. Graphic River has literally thousands of professionally designed PowerPoint templates. If you're a Mac person, use Keynote. Keynote Pro is another great size. But this is really, really useful to allow you to sort of elevate the work that you do from a purely visual way. Again, I'm not a designer. I'd much rather leave that design work to someone else and make my stuff look good through all of their efforts at creating beautiful colors and beautiful templates and all that, so I can focus on my storytelling. And finally, don't fear the blank template, right? Don't fear the blank template. PowerPoint's default is title and bullets. Blank templates are freeing. They're a little bit terrifying, but I find often allow you to simplify what you want to say, because you just put like one thing or one key idea or one key data set on the slide. So don't be afraid of that blank template. It'll free you to be a better speaker and a better designer. Oops. And so my hope is that you can take some of the techniques I talked about a lot today, take techniques from today and create more compelling experiences when you present to your partners and your peers and the parents and the people in your community. So thank you all for your time. I'd be happy to take any questions you might have. And like I said, I'll make sure you all get a copy of today's presentation as well. So if you have questions, you can unmute yourself and ask, or type in the text chat. I will gladly answer any questions that you might have in the couple of minutes I think we have left here today.